So that's David Bickerton and Joe Alexander, both from BP. Before I introduce them and we really get started, maybe a word from my two colleagues at the Purpose Collective. So that's Alberto and Chris. How about a wave and a hello from you, Alberto?
Hi, everyone. That's it. I appreciate
short and sweet.
And it's great to have very inspiring people who do actually the work, and we just can listen and enjoy a coffee in this session. So
excellent. Good morning, everybody. So I'm Chris. It's great to be part of the Purpose Collective with Sarah and Alberto, and thank you to everybody for joining us on this journey. Great to see so many familiar faces and great to see some new faces, and we're really looking forward to this session with Joe and with David.
Great, thanks Alberto, thank you Chris. And just to give you an idea of the shape of the session, it's an hour long and we're going to have some input from Joe and David for about 10 minutes. Then you'll have the opportunity to go into a breakout room, have a conversation with new people. So you'll be meeting 2 or 3, 4 other people. We'll come back together again, we'll hear again from David and Joe, and then there'll be another breakout session, and then we'll all come back together. So a lot of ground we want to cover in the next hour with you. So if I could then just please introduce Joe and David, and I've got a question for each of them before I hand across and we hear from them and the journey they're on with BP in terms of their new purpose. So Joe, if I may come to you first, maybe you could give us a wave. There you are, Joe.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Joe. And Joe, you started your career as a geologist, and now you're at BP as a Purpose Engagement Manager. And I'm wondering, do you still feel like a geologist, and do you miss it?
Yeah, good question. I think being a geologist has informed my career enormously. And whilst geology used to be what I did every day, now geology is kind of why I do what I do. It sounds really kind of hippie, but my love for the earth is why I come to work. And I suppose I've just varied what I do. So I do miss making maps, but other things have taken the place of that, which I've found, a huge amount of growth and excitement in.
Thank you, Joan. It's good to know that your love of the earth, it sounds like it's a thread that sort of run throughout your studies and your career. And I'm guessing we'll hear more about that. And let me come to David as well. So where are you, David? Maybe you could give us all a wave as well. Hi, David.
Hi.
To have you with us. And you're...
I'm on a call. Go just come and just talk to me.
I need your help in English. Oh, I'm wondering whether somebody might need to mute there.
Sarah, I think you mute yourself.
Thank you very much, Alberto. I've unmuted myself. So, David, you're an SVP at BP, and again, we're going to hear more from you shortly. Just an introductory question, please. So, you've been a consultant, you've been an academic, a corporate man, and I'm wondering which of those feels most purposeful for you?
Thank you. It's a good question and lovely to join. This is my first meeting. Yes, I'm a bit of a mongrel, I think is how I describe myself. Not a purebred of anything, but I mean, I see purpose in lots of different ways. When I was a consultant, purpose was being actionable, actually getting things done. When I was an academic, actually purpose was sort of being thoughtful, actually, I think. And I'd say now in the period of my life where I'm a corporate man, so to speak, or a corporate person, purpose is really about being meaningful. And actually, I think in some ways, the most purposeful I've ever felt is actually at the moment inside a large corporation.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And I'm aware you're a visiting fellow at Said Business School at the University of Oxford as well. So you're obviously keeping the academic connections strong too. And I'm going to hand over now to you, back to you, David, and let's hear from you and then Joe about the story of BP's purpose-led journey.
Great, thank you. And we're going to try and do a sort of, two parts to this. So the first part is the past, and we won't go too much into the past. And I'll try and talk a little bit about the sort of corporate situation, and then Joe will talk about the personal situation. And we'll do that for 10 minutes. And then after we've had a breakout, we'll try and sort of do present and future, which I think is sort of all very interesting. So, I mean, obviously BP, you probably all heard of BP. Know what it does. It's 110 years old. It has historically been an oil company. I guess we're probably known for a couple of things when you look at the sort of history of the company. First of all was for a period under Lord John Brown, when we talked about Beyond Petroleum, and we made huge investments in renewables about 20 years ago. And the second thing we're known for, which is not so good, is really around the Deepwater Horizon accident that happened in 2010. And I think that sort of tragedy, plus the Fukushima tragedy in Japan, which happened almost in exactly the same period, I think was a period where people's sort of relationship with energy slightly changed, where people suddenly realized that actually when you plug your phone into the wall and magically energy comes out, they didn't really know that much about what it took to actually produce that energy, and we saw some of the consequences, tragically in two different parts of the world. So I'm really going to sort of talk more about 2019, actually, so not that far, although in these COVID days it feels a long time ago, where we had sort of come out of a period, as I said, of recovery from this sort of terrible experience with the Deepwater Horizon, but where we were starting to look at the future of what an energy company needed to be and do. And recognizing that, there was a growing a groundswell of concern around climate change. It had been there 20 years ago. You can argue it sort of went away, or it went out of the public consciousness a bit with the financial crash of 2008. But it certainly really came back to the fore, particularly in 2019. And I always think we should remind ourselves, certainly sitting in London, in the UK, the first Extinction Rebellion protests were only in April 2019, and I think they have done an extraordinary job as a movement to raise the whole level of concern around climate change. This concept of climate emergency and the need for action really has come to the fore. And we increasingly in BP felt sort of very out of step with this. We were concerned, we had a track record of looking at this sort of area before. But what we found increasingly was, as we tried to talk about this, for those of you who know about the insights, the sort of the psychology profile, the color wheel, I think some people call it. What we recognized, I think, was that we were giving blue answers. As one of my colleagues said, we're giving blue answers to yellow questions. So we're giving rational, factual answers to what are essentially very emotive questions and issues. So we felt out of step with what was happening in the outside world. And we had started to do some work around purpose at that point inside the organization. Some of my colleagues actually said, well, we have a purpose, we provide heat, light and mobility, for customers in the world. And my argument around that wasn't really a purpose statement. That was a description of what we did. It was a what statement. It wasn't a why statement. So we started a piece of work to really look at purpose and why the organization existed. And that brought us into some sort of conflict inside the organization, because people said, well, we've got values, why do we need a purpose as well as values? And we've got a strategy, so why do we need to have this thing called a purpose as well? And something that actually then happened inside the organization, and I would say, very honestly, it happened organically. It didn't happen as a sort of, as a clear strategic decision that the organization wisely took. What we did was we actually set a group of our young, high potential people inside BP. They were called our One Young World ambassadors. For those of you who know the One Young World movement, it's an extraordinary global movement, and we send a set of ambassadors from BP each year to this sort of amazing meeting. And if ever you get the chance to go, you should go. About 30,000 people go, and it's an extraordinary thing. So we set these people off to actually inside the organization to sort of just inquire and try and find out what actually gave meaning to people inside BP. Why in colloquial terms, why did they get out of bed in the morning and come to work? What was their motivation? You know, beyond obviously, you know, earning a salary and putting bread on the table, so to speak. And something sort of very profound came out of that inquiry, actually, quite surprisingly, which was this sort of recognition and this sort of insight that people in BP were very strongly motivated to make a difference, to make a positive difference in the world. So one of my sort of big learnings, and the one thing I wanted to share today, is to get very clear between the difference between values and strategy and purpose. But as I saw it inside BP, our values endure, our strategy evolves, but purpose has to emerge. So, you know, it's a very simple mantra, and it's one that I'm trying to trademark at the moment. So, you know, values endure, strategy evolves, and purpose emerges, because our purpose genuinely started to emerge out of the organization. And this was work that took about nine months last year. It was a very slow process, actually, but I think that was actually really good, because it actually felt very authentic inside the organization as it emerged. And in the meantime, as this was happening, the protests got louder. We had all sorts of different protests against BP and against the industry. And that sort of came to a head at the AGM that we actually ran in Aberdeen in May of 2019. And that led me to Joe. So let me pass over to Joe.
Great, thank you, David. It's great to hear that long history of BP, and I really like what you say about purpose emerging, and you describe how purpose emerged inside the company quite organically. And weirdly, and in parallel, and at the same time, I was on the outside of BP and purpose was emerging for me, but just in a different context. And I suppose the two collided. So before I talk about the AGM experience, which was a bit of a moment, I'll backtrack a little bit just to kind of say how I got there. So I'm a geologist and worked at BP for over a decade, exploring for oil and gas. And I left the company about 6 years ago because I felt that what I was doing was in conflict with my concern for climate change. And as a geologist, I understood kind of climate history and kind of the urgency of the issue. So I just thought, I can't stay, I've got to do something else. So I went on this kind of exploration. I did the On Purpose program. I worked at Blueprint, and those completely changed my life for the better, and found my way to working at Share Action, an NGO that tries to make investment a force for good in the world. And as kind of, and then I also did this course, the Forum for the Future on Systems Change, and all of those things kind of came together in this perfect storm where I decided to ask a question at BP's AGM in May 2019. Little did I know that all of these conversations were already going on within the company, but you couldn't tell that from the outside, and I just felt, I think, a bit frustrated and wanted to just kind of tell the story of why I left. And then also, having spoken to former colleagues, I realized that they were also worried about climate change, but they didn't feel it was kind of relevant to their jobs, and it also, they weren't able to leave their job, so they kind of reconciled themselves to a job that wasn't meaningful but paid. So that was something that I raised at the AGM, and I kind of expected it to land like a lead balloon, but I was quite surprised that at the end of the AGM, Bernard Looney, who was the head of Upstream at the time, who is now our CEO, he came and found me and said, "Your question made me feel very sad." And I was quite surprised by how kind of genuinely he said that, and it kind of I was a bit of an emotional moment. And he said, "You have to come and talk to me about this more." So I had kind of 3 months before an hour-long meeting with Bernard Looney and Jeff Morrell, who's our head of communications and advocacy. So I used those 3 months to do an investigation, talk to 30 people in quite a lot of depth about how they felt about climate change, and presented it to them. And during that meeting, or towards the end, they said, we think we're going to adopt a purpose. And I just instinctively said, "You can't do that without me." I just couldn't, I didn't even think about it. I just thought, I've always had a kind of special place in my heart for the company. I've never felt that they were, the bad guys that they seem to be painted to be, and felt that, moving beyond petroleum, as we tried in the early 2000s, was part of our DNA. So I really, really think, I really wanted us to do this. So I'm thrilled to be back at BP, helping kind of this purpose to reimagine energy for people on our planet, helped that become a reality for the company. So that is the story. I've got so carried away with it, I've forgotten my train of thought. But I suppose the other things I wanted to say was, you know, that conversation with Bernard, I think, kickstarted a lot of conversations that he had with critics, and he really listened carefully, and it gave him a lot of input to think about, you know, how he wanted to shape the company when he became CEO. And I suppose I'm very impressed that he would reach out and want to hear from his critics. And he often says, I'm paraphrasing slightly, but, you know, Bernard says, you know, there's no point talking to people who agree with you, and listening makes us better. I think that's something we're going to continue. And I think I remember him saying after those meetings, he, you know, increasingly felt like the company had to change. So I'm really thrilled that we're on this journey. And I suppose that leads us to our first breakout question. We thought it would be interesting to reflect on those critical voices. So when you encounter a critical voice in relation to your purpose or strategy or anything, how do you, or how have you responded? And what impact have those critical voices had on you and the organizations you work for? Great.
Great, thank you so much, Joe and David. And I'm trying to pop that question in the chat there so everybody can see that. So in a moment, we're going to go into breakout rooms. I think that includes both David and Joe are going to go into a room as well. So be in the conversation. And just while Chris is working his magic to put people into breakout rooms, I'm just going to say it's just great to hear some of the story there of BP. And one of the things I've learned in my work as a business psychologist is that in a healthy organization and a healthy leadership team, past is acknowledged and it's talked about, including the difficult episodes, and acknowledging those more critical voices of stakeholders is also part, I think, of making solid progress. So I really appreciate those angles that you've brought in. And we're going to go into the breakout rooms, I think.
So I'm going to open the rooms. They'll be in rooms of 3 or 4. So we're going to click the button now, and we will be back in just over 10 minutes.
Great, thanks, Chris. A few seconds for everybody to come back into the main room here. We hope you had some good discussions in those breakout rooms. So I'm going to suggest, I could imagine your heads might be buzzing with all sorts of thoughts, questions, things you want to share. I'm going to ask you please to hold those for now, because we want to hear again from Joe and David, and then have another breakout room conversation, and then come back together all at the end where hopefully we can hear some of your questions and comments. So having heard about the history of BP coming up to 2019, I think we're going to hear more about what's currently happening and the future. So I'm going to come back to David and Joe to give us some more input. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So I guess, yeah, I mean, there were a couple of questions just before we left for the breakout that were quite useful about, you know, this issue of purpose emerging and how does it inform strategy. So, you know, to sort of pick up the chronological thread, if you like, we announced a new chief executive was taking over last October, Bernard Looney. He really was very engaged with this concept of purpose and wanted to ensure that purpose and ambition were very tied together, but actually everything actually came from purpose. So in February of this year, we sort of launched a net zero ambition, but we based it off the purpose of the organization, which is reimagining energy for people on our planet. And he then said very clearly, look, the strategy needs to be informed by this, and we will come back to you later in the year, as we did in September this year, with the strategy and with explaining how this sort of fits into a broader approach to sustainability. So very much, you know, everything built off the purpose, actually, which, you know, to the conversation we were just having in our breakout, you know, this can't be a strap line. It can't come out of marketing. It can't come out of communications. It has to be owned by the leadership. There has to be conviction in it that if you're going to do this and you're going to be really purpose-led, then it has to inform every part of what you do. It has to be part of the DNA. It has to be part of your decision making and your strategy. And what we've started to do, and we've only really started to do it, as I say, we're on a journey here, probably 10 years behind Unilever, as we were just discussing, that we've made a series of announcements as part of this process around reducing our oil and gas production by 40% in the next 10 years. Unthinkable from a couple of years ago that a company would do that. Adjusting a lot of our forward price assumptions. We've had to halve the dividend. Of course, that's partly COVID related, but actually in doing that, it allows us to reinvest more into future sort of low carbon energy businesses. We've reframed some of our relationships with some of the trade associations. We've publicly withdrawn from some of those, and where we disagree with them, we now sort of publish our disagreement. We've started to enter into new partnerships with cities, people like the city of Aberdeen and the city of Houston, new partnerships with companies like Microsoft and Uber. And a lot of this has actually come out of becoming more clear on our purpose. You know, that's what's attracting some of these companies to want to partner with a company like BP. Difficult always going to cause an effect on some of these things, but I think it's the conviction and the way we've set about this that is starting to open up new partnerships for us, which is sort of very important. But there's more, and I think I'll hand over to Joe, because, you know, one of my experiences when we did our values 10 years ago was, you know, you can write things on pieces of paper, but actually you have to have a very difficult crisis to really know whether these values are real. And we had a terrible, we had a terrorist attack in 2013 in Algeria, where the response of the whole company was just the values of the organization. You couldn't have written it down. And I believe, as Joe will speak to, you know, we've had the same experience with COVID, that what would a purpose-led organization do to respond to a global pandemic? Joe, over to you.
Great. Thank you, David. I think you've outlined some of the incredibly exciting things that we've done this year to kind of prove that we're serious about this new direction, our purpose. But exactly as you say, kind of when times get hard, that's when it really shows up. And this year has been an incredibly hard year for all kinds of reasons, but particularly COVID-19 has been an incredible challenge. But it's also shown us how our people respond in a very purposeful way to that crisis. And it's been so amazing to see what people across BP have been doing kind of off their own back, obviously with our support, but, you know, the people 3D printing PPE from their garages, also making aprons for frontline health workers in Madrid, donating kind of spare food to communities and food banks in Sunbury, and BP's given fuel to emergency services, and also given our supercomputer for COVID-19 modeling. So there's just been a huge amount of things that we've just found whatever we could do, we've done. And I think, and then another thing I forgot to say was, you know, we've supported the charity Mind, and Bernard Looney always talks about mental health. He's very passionate about that. And all of these things kind of show me how, you know, the people part of our purpose comes so naturally to BP. Like, people in BP are really generous, caring. It's part of our culture, and it's just heartening to see. And I think increasingly, you know, the piece I kind of want to push, and increasingly we're seeing, you know, that connection across to our planet, and helping people make that they've already got that care and that empathy, and how we kind of make that connection to say, you know, that's why we need to look after our planet. I think that is now the second thing that is coming very naturally. And I've felt kind of a win. You know, Juliet and I have been part of designing the series of workshops for the top 100 leaders. And one of those leaders appeared on a call. You know, we do these calls with the whole company, thousands of people join, and a leader called David Eiton from our innovation and engineering entity talked with real passion about, you know, the loss of biodiversity, because he's a bird watcher, and how, you know, climate change and biodiversity and ecosystems are all interconnected. And it was amazing to hear. So those conversations are increasing, and I find that really heartening as well. The other thing that's really hard about this year, and the difficult thing that change brings, is redundancies. We're busy kind of redesigning the company, and that means we're making 10,000 people redundant by the end of the year out of our 70,000 approximately staff. And that, I think, because we are so close and a family to some extent, it's very hard to say goodbye to good people. So that organizational change is a challenge, but I think our purpose is helping us in that as well. So when we think about communicating and what we can do to help people, I think purpose is kind of good for all seasons. So we're talking to people about like personal purpose, helping them think about how they want to design their futures, whether they want to leave the company or stay, and make that expression known, but also understand kind of the purposeful business movement and how business and finance are changing, and if they are, whether they're staying or going, that is something that everybody needs to have an awareness of. So yes, those are the two challenges of the year that I wanted to talk about in relation to our purpose. And then now I'm going to introduce kind of the next question, which is all around the future, really. So David's talked very much about the changes that have happened in BP, which have kind of been cascaded from the top, very kind of top-down led change. And I'm very aware that as we reimagine energy and we ask our people to get creative in service of that purpose, it can't be top-down led. It has to be led by everybody. So we know we need to make this cultural shift from kind of a top-down hierarchical organization. We want to move away from that and be a much more kind of emergent and creative organization. So that is the next challenge. We obviously have a few ideas of how we're going to do that, but we'd love to hear what you all think, how you can kind of flip that cultural script. So yeah, I'll post the question in the chat, maybe.
Great, thank you, Jo. If you can pop that question in the chat. So again, in a moment, we'll go into breakout rooms and have a discussion about sort of how to flip the script, and so that everybody feels on board with the purpose-led journey. And just great to hear from David also about just how foundational the purpose is at BP for the strategy. It's not just a strap line, and it needs to be not just espoused, but really lived by everybody in the organisation. So I think, Chris, are you working for magic? Brilliant, thank you. And
we'll open the rooms, back in the same rooms, back with the people you chatted with earlier, and we'll see you back in 10 minutes.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. So in the last few minutes we really want to open the space for questions, for comments, for observations. And I understand, I think Jo and David are up for engaging here as part of the larger group. So if you'd just like to raise your hand and unmute yourself, and please join the dialogue in this larger forum. So I'm hoping we've got some questions or comments. Merimna, I hope I pronounced your name. Would you like to come in?
Yes, thank you. Okay, I'm unmute. Yes, so thank you, Jo and David. I'm very impressed. I come from the oil industry. I was still a member of the Society of Petroleum Engineers, and I am also a consultant for Passion and Purpose for the last 8 years. And I'm wondering, when you listen to that guy who is so passionate about biodiversity, are you giving voice to other people in the company to tell you how are they passionate about sustainability? Because there are so many different areas of sustainability, so many. Are you giving voice to each person to express what area of sustainability is meaningful to them? Thank you for what you are doing.
Great. Let me start and try and give you. Thank you for the question. Yes, I mean it's a really good point, because we started in February of this year very much talking about climate and talking about net zero and the carbon agenda, if you like. And there was a lot of discussion inside the organisation about sustainability more generally, and what about biodiversity? What about human rights? There's a whole set of different issues. How do we make sure that we are really living our purpose, because we talk about people and planet is not just climate change. So there's been quite a, and we were discussing it actually, I love the phrase that was given to me about an underground movement. There was been quite an underground movement inside the organization around things like biodiversity, to make sure that, it is represented, there is a voice on it, we have the right commitments, but I think also attention about, where can we make the most meaningful contributions, because we can't do everything. And BP is a company that tries to do everything sometimes, wants to be, wants to be involved in everything that's possible to be involved with. So there's a tension there, and biodiversity is one of the key parts of our sustainability frame. Joe has way more expertise on biodiversity than me, so I should let her comment.
Oh, thank you, David. No, I suppose I'll express my opinion. Like, I suppose I'm very aware of the interconnected nature of all of the SDGs, and climate change and biodiversity are two of the things that Kate Raworth talks about, kind of going beyond the planetary boundaries. So they're really critical to address, and they are both kind of existential issues for humanity. But my view, I really like what David said about, like, where can we make the most meaningful contribution? And as an energy company that produces oil and gas, a lot of it at the moment, and in the future a lot less, but it feels like a responsibility to address climate change first. And I do feel like, unless you do that, you don't get permission to play in the other areas. And I think the wonderful thing is, because we have got now a plan, which I think is very credible, to transition away from oil and gas and towards lower carbon energy, it gives us the permission to play in those other areas. And we have a new sustainability frame that acknowledges what we want to do for net zero, for people and planet. But we couldn't do that diversity of things without addressing the kind of huge issue of climate change. So yeah, there's been a lot of work on the sustainability frame, and lots of contributions from employees on that. So yeah, thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Question from Deborah.
Hi everyone. I'm so happy to be here. I love coming to these sessions. I'm just going to cut right to the chase, and I think talking about the idea of purpose and the fact that the profits, that we know what's happening at BP. We realize that the redundancies that you brought up, and the fact that I come originally from the fashion business in the 80s and 90s, manufacturing pipeline business growth, Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4. It's all about making growth, right? And you talked about the fact that you're going to now reduce some of the expectations for growth. I would love to hear more about that, because that's going to be the only way to align purpose if we're not on a trajectory of constant growth. So I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, and it's a great question, Deborah. It's a tension, because clearly we talk in very simple terms about sort of three audiences: our staff, our broader society, and our shareholders, and the need to meet the expectations of all three, and there are some tensions between them. So one of the things we've made a very clear commitment about is that to transform the company, we need to perform, which means we need to still be very good at what we currently do in our core business, to fund that transition into low carbon. And it's a concern at the moment. Our share price is at the lowest it's been for 30 years, as most of our sector is at the moment. That's not a comfortable place to be. It is partly to do with COVID, but also it is partly to do with the fact that shareholders are nervous about this energy transition, and are openly questioning who are the right people to be involved with it. So it's a good direct question, and it's a tension for us at the moment, that we need to make the case that, and again, here's, I have a lot of empathy with people who are activists who want change and want change quickly. But to be honest, we cannot just go out of business if we're going to make a contribution. So we have to balance making enough money to make the transition. That's the capitalist model, and I think we should be unapologetic about that. But it is recognizing that a more purposeful organization does look at those trade-offs in a slightly different way now. That it's not all about profit. It is actually about what do we do that actually helps the other parts of that triangle, if you like. What are we doing broader to help society in terms of this? But recognizing we're also not a charity. You know, we
Can
have
I
shareholders.
add one point is that I hope what BP does is I hope, you know, a lot of the word is transparency. There's a lot of words at the moment, right? That during COVID that we're hearing. I work in peace building. And I hope that for BP, that at the end of the day, you're so authentic, as one of the people in our group said, you're so authentic about your mission that you literally pull up your accounts, show us your ledger, and see that it all matches. We do support purpose and we are supporting, you know, blah, 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 whatever, but show your accounts, because I mean, you can tell by my American accent that this is not something that has been happening in the United States, and it has now revealed itself because the curtain is down. And that I've got friends who've been, you know, head of BP, Middle East, et cetera, over the years. So if the accounting isn't going to be on display, not transparent, on display, so that people can see how it matches, these are just words. But I mean, I say that with full respect, because I do believe you guys care.
Yeah, and you're right. And I've been looking at the thread, and it's absolutely right. Transparency is absolutely key to all of this, because if your words don't match, or your actions don't match your words, you know, we live in a world now where you have to be transparent, because if there's a disconnect between this, that's, you know, that's where your problems really lie. And we've, you know, I'll give you one example. You know, trade associations. We've published a report on trade associations to try and be more transparent about how we lobby and how we influence. And when we published that, Bernard Looney actually had a call internally with all of our key regional people, and he made it very clear, saying, this is now what we're doing, this is where we're going. If you are doing something that is in opposition to that, it will get called out, and that has to stop. It doesn't mean that that will not take a bit of time. It doesn't mean that the people who are out there watching from Greenpeace or from Influence Map and people like that, that's their role, I think, to call us to account. And I think that's where the dialogue really has to be constructive around this. But you're absolutely right. Transparency is completely key to this. And I understand there's certain things around commercial confidentiality, but it's all too easy to hide behind that as an excuse for not being transparent. And I think one of the things we've set out is we will be transparent about this and talk about our progress, and to as far as we can, as you say, open the books, because if the book isn't open, you will not have that trust and you'll not have that permission.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Deborah, for the great question. I'm conscious we've overrun on time. I'd just like to show our appreciation for Joe and David for their openness and transparency, and for joining us today, because it's been a really great session. So thank you both very much. And we could sort of show our virtual kind of appreciation for David and Joe. We're just coming to an end, just very quickly. We wanted to say that we've got another session in 2 weeks' time. We've got Alex Edmonds, who's a professor at London Business School, who wrote the second best book on purpose this year. And obviously the best book on purpose this year has been written by our very own Sarah Rosenthaler. And if you haven't got it, please get it. But if you've enjoyed the conversation today, it's going to be another great conversation in 2 weeks' time. His book, Grow the Pie, is a really great book about business purpose and the business case for it. So thank you very much, David. Thank you very much, Joe. And thank you for everybody for joining us for this conversation about purpose. And hopefully we will see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Luego te llamo.
Ciao, Sarah.
Okay. Ciao.